Good. It's good.
The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
All right. I'm going to try not to geek out on today's show a little bit, but may not be able to. Hello, welcome back to the show, everyone. We are exploring empathy-driven systems and leadership and technology today. I'm Stephen Sketch here with Julio Saragusa and Mike Lusky and our special guest. We are live, so if you have questions or comments, send them along and we'll try to get them in the mix during the conversation. Mike, introduce our guest today.
Absolutely, Stephen, would love to. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that. Andrea Goulet is an accomplished.
Nothing like being live and having the blunder. Huh?
Nothing like that, right at the intro.
It's all good. My name is a hard one. It's like, yeah.
I know. I even practiced it. But,
I know.
So Andrea is an accomplished entrepreneur and a thought leader in the software space, known really for pioneering empathy-driven leadership. She's a serial entrepreneur, having started 6 organizations. Most recently, she's the founder of Empathy in Tech, where she's empowering technical teams to build better software through human connection. She's the co-author of the book Empathy-Driven Software Development and has been recognized as a global keynote speaker, sharing her insights at TEDx and conferences around the world. Her background spans a unique combination of technical acumen and soft skills, allowing her really to blend software development with a focus on collaboration and trust. Her work emphasizes really the importance of leading with empathy, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and I know our listeners are really interested in. And it's about an approach that not only transforms technical projects, but actually impacts the direction that businesses take at a fundamental level. So with that, welcome to our show, Andrea.
Thank you so much. Just a quick correction on the bio. I haven't actually spoken at TEDx yet, but I know I keynote at software conferences and like leadership conferences all over the world, but just for some reason hasn't. So maybe that'll happen.
If the TEDx people are out there and if you're listening, you got to get this lady on your show.
Yeah. So.
Hey,
We're making predictions here.
Yeah.
Andrea, this may sound like a simple question, but what is empathy?
That is not a simple question. And it's a really fascinating question. And that was kind of one of the things that really launched me into this big journey. So I used to think empathy was kind of a character trait, like a psychic ability. You know, that's what like Deanna Troi kind of thing from Star Trek, where you walk into a room. And I was in sales when I started my career. So I was good at this stuff. And it's about reading minds, inferring what people think, right? There's a little bit of inference, like that's a big part of it. But what we're learning is that empathy is really what I describe it as the mechanism that humans developed over time through evolution that enables us to collaborate, communicate, and solve complex problems together. And so empathy is part of our bodies. It is like our respiratory system. And there are many functional components for it. My favorite researcher here is Jean Decity. His research agenda has been on the functional architecture of human empathy. So like, how does empathy actually show up in our bodies? And there's 4 things. Emotional regulation. So if we can't listen and like handle our own emotions and stay calm and present, we can't empathize, right? Affect, so emotion sharing, right? Feeling, that's important. Cognitive empathy, which is perspective taking. It's using the more logical and rational side of our brain. And then motivation. And in the literature, this comes up as empathic concern, which is also compassion. So caring and wanting to do something about it. So seeing somebody struggle and then actually being motivated to learn more and then take action. So in a nutshell, that's what empathy is. But it's much more. I had somebody once and they were like, why are you writing a book about empathy? It's not that hard. Just look it up in the dictionary. But when you look it up in the dictionary, it's actually like so many things, it's not accurate. So that was why, as I started to learn more And in my work, I came from marketing and then went into software, and the people that I'm around are super kind and compassionate people who didn't get communication training in their computer science programs. And they want really precise, definite, like, how explicitly do I do this? Like, what is the process? And I couldn't answer that. So I just started learning more and more and more. And it goes deep. It goes just as deep as any software, anything. So that's why I started describing it as technical empathy. Because when we own it and we say there is a deep amount of knowledge here, and I'm going to do my best on learning more so that I can apply it effectively, that's what takes it from kind of a, virtue. Yeah. I mean, we want to have empathy, but there's also places that it can go not great, So, an example of that is if you have too much cognitive empathy, you're able to see somebody else's perspective, but you don't care about them, right? We see this a lot of times in marketing and around deceptive patterns, right? Where an example might be like having opt-in first, and there's a whole bunch of those. So paying attention to those details, knowing where they show up, knowing the technical terminology of these things, I think is one of the most important things that humans can do. Because if we have big problems to solve, we need to understand the mechanism that helps us solve it.
What's interesting with your definition, and I kind of wonder why we struggle with it, is I think in business, empathy is inevitable. Right? It's inevitable because it's kind of wired into us to get things done, like you mentioned, sort of, together in a way. And why is it that we struggle so much to bring it into business when it's part of life and part of growing as a human?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with cultural perceptions. So we have kind of this history, especially in the software industry, of there are hard skills, math, there's hard sciences, and then there's soft things, soft skills. This is a place I could nerd out. I won't. I have a in-depth article about how the term soft skills is a myth and shouldn't have become a thing. I went and researched some of the history
Mike
of
mentioned it in the intro, and I kind of raised my eyebrow a little bit. I'm like, maybe we should.
Yeah. So, and around the same time that kind of the term soft skills was starting to take off in the industry, you also had a lot of mass advertising in the 60s that was very, very consciously tying soft to feminine qualities. And so there's this whole big mishmash. And then we've got biases where men are the people who belong and leadership and in the CEO suite. And we just haven't had, historically, examples of women in large leadership roles. So I think it's more of an impression that empathy is weak. And there's data that backs this up. The company Business Solver puts out the State of Workplace Empathy report every year. And the number one reason by about, I think it's 60% of CEOs report not displaying empathy at work because they think they'll be seen as weak. And I think that comes from a misunderstanding of what empathy is. Because we think empathy is this psychic ability.
I think it comes from this sort of dominator hierarchy role where I've got to be in this dominator role. Whereas if you flip that to I'm in service to my employees, then I'm going to be more empathetic. But I think it's really that where 80% of companies are or whatever right now. It's that sort of dominator hierarchy role. And I don't want to be seen as, getting knocked off the top or weak, but really when you start flipping the conversation to, can you be in service to your employees? Then it just comes sort of naturally, and the vulnerability and all those things come naturally as skills that you develop. And so I kind of think that's where the consciousness in business, where it's kind of got to evolve, is switching out of that.
Yeah.
Actually, I think when you really think about it, it's very natural, very similar to nature in itself. Nature is an interdependent model. It is in constant service unto itself. And there's no judgment on which plays a bigger role or a smaller role. There's just an understanding, and that understanding is what makes this flow and work very naturally. So, but for some reason we disconnected from that and think we have to just be logical and practical and rational in business. And that's so you said something interesting about working with software engineers. I spent most of my career working with software engineers, and I found that they're actually artists, very creative.
Very
and you would
creative.
think that of someone just working with code, but they're actually artists. And they have some incredible insights about a lot of things. So I'm curious, in terms of empathy, what kind of impact have you seen it have on team dynamics and their productivity? Because often people disconnect this idea of empathy actually being tied to improving productivity. What's it been like for you to see sort of a culture of empathy transform the way team operate on their day-to-day basis and their productivity?
Yeah, this is where I'm really excited to go next, because in the research, empathy is the biggest driver of innovation. Because if we just hang out in our silos and in our affinity groups, we're not getting any new ideas.
Yeah.
And empathy is the mechanism. It's the ability for us to connect with, understand people who are different than us, and together create things that no one of us could create alone. And it can, the way that I see it the most is in individual interaction. So I'll share a story from a workshop that I gave a while ago. So there was one person who was responsible for testing. And when I give these workshops, one of the things I said, pick a pebble problem. We don't want to go through like trauma or anything like that, but like something that is, has the 3 F's, I call it. So it's frustrating, it's got a lot of friction to it, and it's frequent, like just something that is annoying that you step on every day. So this was, this engineer was like, I'm creating these in-depth reports. They're like 50 pages long, and the developer isn't paying attention to them. And so there's bugs all the time. But he said, I'm doing the work, but he's lazy and doesn't care. Now, when we understand technical empathy, then we can pretty quickly see what's going on there. That is an example of the fundamental attribution error, which is a way of our brains taking a shortcut that says when something is a struggle, when it happens to me, I attribute it to my circumstances. When it happens to somebody else, I'm going to attribute it to their character flaws. And so we just did a quick magic quadrant and say, okay, well, we've got 2 of the boxes filled in. We can't eliminate biases, but we can balance them. And said, okay, can you see like anything about this person's situation that might be causing struggles? This person's like, no, they're lazy, like doubled down on it. I was like, okay, well, let's go to the other box. Like, what are some of the character challenges that you're struggling with? And it's like the 2 biggest ones that I see are shame, which is fearing that you're going to lose belonging, or contempt, which is feeling like you're better than someone. And as soon as I said that, he said, well, I am better than him. But he had been saying that in his head for a long time, and it was just a kind of reflex. But as soon as he did, everything changed. And within 2 minutes, he was able to recognize, oh my gosh, do you know what I'm doing? This person has ADHD and a really demanding boss. And I am putting together reports in blocks of prose in a way that I know he's not going to be able to make a mistake. And I'm using it to CYA so that when a problem comes, I can just blame it on him. I'm wondering maybe a better way might be if I recorded a video of myself doing the test, and then I'll give him timestamps. That's going to be faster for me. That's going to be easier for him. Let me just email him real quick. And like all of that took place in 2 minutes. That's a huge operational improvement. Now imagine that happening multiple times a day across your organization. This is what we're talking about in terms of efficiency. And I know this personally because in building my software company, my co-founder, very different from me, very different. I'm a high level kind of ideas person. He's he's a twig person, like not just forests and trees, and we would clash all the time. But when we were able to approach it with compassion and heated debate a lot of times, but always come back to trying to understand each other, we had the best ideas that then scaled.
I think that the key on what, like at the very end there, you said, always try to come back to understanding each other. I think, and we always say, what we say is make connection the goal of the communication, because then you aren't, putting all this other stuff in there. It's like, I want to understand you and make sure we're both understood.
Yeah. And when it
just want
comes to empathy and innovation, just real quick, like I have a model around like, you can't be in innovation all the time because it's exhausting. Trying to understand somebody is work. So there's a restore phase where you got to take care of yourself. You got to be around the people who just get you, but you can't stay there. And so empathy then is the explore phase. And so the ability to shift back and forth to that, and the faster that we can do that, that's where the innovation happens.
I just think that was such a perfect example of one, self-awareness, which you raised in him, so he could see how his own being was being projected. Two, collective awareness, understanding the surroundings, and then being able to apply emotional intelligence. In this case, it was an example of empathy. Oh, I see why I do that. Well, that's kind of not fair to that individual. What if I did it differently? Such a beautiful example of, I think, the key underlying ingredient to achieving empathy is self-awareness. You have to have it. And then collective awareness too of what's going on around you is such a key thing.
And I think this is why it's really, really important for us to use technical terms and use precision, because like, oh, here's the problem. Let's diagnose it. You are not a bad person. You're not antisocial. You're not lacking in emotional intelligence. He knew how he felt. He felt contempt. He didn't know how to move past it. Right. And I think this is one of the big challenges from working in the software industry is a lot of times we see people who are struggling. We don't understand them. And so then we scapegoat them. And this is something I had to come to terms with as feeling like I'm a stereotypical empath, is that a lot of times when I was thinking about empathy, I was actually thinking about hubris. I was thinking that I could just walk into a room and know exactly what everybody else was feeling, and I didn't need any more data. Whereas all of us will benefit when we have mirrors held up to us. And when we know, oh, you know what, you're struggling with this thing. Because when we have the precision, then we know how to fix it. And so I that's why I think technical empathy is just so important, because it helps us get to those root causes. And when you know, then it's like it unlocks everything.
It was pretty neat too that they had that, kind of love in that example that you gave, had that love as the motivator to actually, once they recognized it, go ahead and make the change. So Andrea, a little bit earlier, you were talking about the importance of culture, and oftentimes the leadership, will help to build that culture or define that culture. So I'm curious, now that you've founded Empathy in Tech, and then even with your experience in the past, what are some of the challenges that you faced in getting either people in the organization, maybe perhaps even the leadership, to understand the value of leading with empathy?
Yeah, I think, for leaders to understand the value of leading with empathy, I personally have attracted all of my co-founders and the folks that I've personally worked with. I haven't encountered that. So the data, but I can definitely tell you about like building it so that it is applied effectively.
Yeah.
I think that one of the biggest challenges personally that I had was I was too empathetic, where I didn't set good boundaries. I didn't hold people accountable. And we tend to have this other misconception of empathy, is that empathy is letting it all hang out. Empathy is making it so that you can do whatever you want, and that, people will always accommodate you, and that it will excuse any behavior. And that could not be further from the truth. Right. Empathy and accountability go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that for leaders, it's like recognizing that, then it's like, well, what do you want people to be accountable to? Right. So to me, the way I led, and learned over the years, was one of the most important things that a leader can do is, because they set the tone for the culture, but they don't own the culture. Everyone collectively owns the culture. So the most important thing that a leader, whether it's a leader of a team or, a department, a whole organization, whatever, set a very clear mission, vision, and core values. So the mission is, what do we want to achieve? What is the goal that we're trying to work towards? Vision is, why do we want to achieve it? What does the world look like when we're on the other side and this thing is solved? And then the core values, I think, are the most important, where they are behavioral agreements of this is how we will act in covenant with each other
Right.
when we are achieving this goal. And I think one of the, when it comes down to communications, one of the biggest problems I see with organizations is that they frame their core values as outcomes and not actions. So we tend to say innovation. No, innovation is an outcome. Innovation is something that you get from a lot of work and people working together effectively. Calm the chaos. That was one of Corgi Bites' core values. And that was the hardest one for me. But that was one my business partner was like, no, this has to happen. And so in meetings, when things would get hard, we invoked them. It was like, okay, y'all, we can calm the chaos.
Yeah.
Let's take a break. We'll come back to this tomorrow. And that is the real benefit of a core value. And so that is a clear expectation and a clear way to hold each other accountable. But culture, Edgar Schein has done some great work on this. Culture is the collective behavioral norms and shared learning that happens from a group of people. So the CEO can set the tone, but everyone, the way that they're interacting with each other can then also generate. So, the example that I just gave earlier, that was a culture of contempt between those two people. And to me, I think the way that I define a leader is that a leader is anyone who looks outside of themselves and sees a relationship system and wants to improve it. And a system can be as simple as you and one other person. So that transformation from the test engineer was, I'm doing all this, I'm blaming the other person. There was disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you say, no, this is about us, this is a shared connection, how can I make that exchange more effective? Then you transition into a leader. So it has nothing to do with titles. It has nothing, like, there are just leaders who, see bigger systems, but it starts there. And I think that's incredibly empowering because, you're so many people, and I felt this way, feel like cogs in a wheel. You just feel like you're, you have no say in anything. You have no agency. And that is a horrible place to be.
That's where most of business is right now. So
Yeah.
there are a couple of stages in consciousness where systems thinking really plays a big role. First we kind of explore and sort of create these dry systems out of necessity and innovation, right? And that's kind of what you're talking about a little bit, is just these, just your basic systems, everything where it's kind of machinery and you feel like a cog and all that. And this is much rarer, but then it comes back to when you intentionally build love and higher purpose and empathy into these systems. This is where I think you build that soul and that rock and roll, and that you start to create this more, living system. And this is where meaning and purpose can be found, right? That's what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, because if everybody is aligned to a shared purpose, which is defined by your mission and vision, like, awesome, right? You know where you're going. You might not know how you're going to get there. This was also a huge mindset shift for me. When I went to business school, I learned how to manage complicated systems. A lot of it was like a widget, Gantt charts, like, production line. And even when I, ran my marketing companies, it's like, okay, I get X inputs, I run it through Y process, and then I can very predictably produce Z results, right? When I moved into the software world, all of that broke down and my brain melted because I was introduced to these concepts of agile, and it's like, you have to fail fast. And I was like, that makes no sense. We don't want to fail. We want to succeed. We want to be able to pay our mortgage and eat. But the biggest insight that I had is that there is a fundamental difference between a complicated system, which is linear, and a complex system where impacts happen exponentially. And we can see this in viruses, ecosystems, economies, right? Any social thing for sure. And so knowing about the principles of how those complex systems work, so specifically complex dynamic adaptive systems is the precise term. But again, that there's some fascinating things here. And for me, what I had to learn was that I was not the top of the system. I was not the driver of the system. I was a part of the system.
Yeah. And sometimes
Yeah.
you will be when needed that top piece, but then you fall
Yeah.
back where someone else becomes that top part. And you have this that's what we're going through with our building of our self-managed teams right now, is that you will have that more of that fluidity in what you're doing. And there is a little chaos in there and stuff, but it's super effective, super fast, super efficient.
But even that doesn't need to be complicated. It's really just three systems if we really think about it. There's codependency, which is your traditional command and control hierarchical environment. Then you have independence, which is chaotic because everybody does whatever they want. And ultimately, if we want to mimic nature, it's interdependence, which is the ultimate expression of empathy, which is why self-managed teams work only when you have interdependence. Now, you said something earlier, which is you have to have absolute accountability in that model, right? Because if the sun decided to stop shining, the whole system would collapse, right? So there's an accountability to continuously be giving. And so I'm curious in terms of someone who's co-authored a book about empathy-driven software development. You co-authored a book. How do you see empathy, for example, playing a role in the future work? Because we know these other systems, they're failing us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then how does AI and automation come into play in perhaps improving these human connections, or does it get lost in the process?
I hope it doesn't get lost in the process, right? And I think that there are many places where AI can help us do things more effectively and more efficiently, right? One of the challenges is that by doing that, we are displacing a lot of workers. And so being really honest about the struggles that these modernizations are having on society and helping people find new places and new roles. In terms of empathy in the broader landscape, there is evidence that the value of empathy, the economic value of empathy, is increasing because, at least as of now, and it's one of the hardest problems for computers to solve, is empathy. Is that shared understanding and that nuance and that back and forth. We can simulate it in a Turing test where it's like, oh, you kind of sound like a computer, human, you sound conversation. That's not empathy, right? It's not truly understanding someone. So, and I think third is one of the things I'm working on, is help. I'm really excited about helping organizations move through this in kind of a maturity model way. So I'm putting together kind of a maturity model of like, how do you go from a chaotic or just command and control system into something where there is healthy collaboration? And so through the research, it's kind of 4 different stages. First, you've got to build capacity. If people are exhausted, you can't self-organize.
Things get stretched. People get stretched. And
yeah. And I mean, this is physical, it's mental load. Like, are we task switching all the times, or we have mental meetings? Like, it's emotional, it's environmental. Like, the number of teams that I've worked with where they're like, the problem is the hardware, and the finance team is like, oh, it's fine. And it's like, no, I need faster processing. And that is the holdback, right? And so sometimes it's very structural. So building capacity first, then it's communication. And the exciting thing here is that in human communication, there's a lot of math behind it. And we know that from computer science, but there is a lot that we can draw from. But the on how do we get a bit of information from computer A to computer B to how do we get an idea from brain A to brain B. And so the more we understand that technically, then it's like, oh, well, I do this and here's this. And I wish I could geek out about this. This is like where I'm super passionate, but I'll skip it. And then next is culture, which we already talked about, making sure that we have an environment in which people will thrive. One of my favorite quotes is by W. Edwards Demings, and it's a bad system will be a good individual every time. Right. So this is where we're really thinking about the systems. And then finally is collaboration. So how do we move through that restore and explore cycle so that we are most likely to generate the innovation that we're seeking? So not everyone's going to get to that collaboration stage, but it starts with capacity building.
So we got a question here from one of our listeners group. So Martha, she's saying she's loving the show. Question for Andrea. From our listener, what advice would you give to leaders who worry that showing empathy could make them feel soft or even less authoritative?
Yeah, I would say probably do some inward reflection on why do you think that, right? There might be some, like, we have been culturally primed for many decades. Yeah. So, this is similar to me. I think it's the flip side. Like when I grew up, it was in the 80s, and I just saw a lot of media of girls don't code. I remember war games, for example. Like my business partner loved it. It was like, oh my gosh, when like he looked like the the main hero, the Matthew Broderick character. I was like, wow, look at all the power I can have. I can be in charge of nuclear warheads from my bedroom. Like that feels very powerful. The scene that I remember the most was that the character that looked like me wasn't even allowed to go into the computer lab because she would be a distraction for the people who were there and getting the work done. So that's just one example of like, I saw that and, over the years, and I started to internalize that and feel like, oh, I don't belong. I don't look like them. This is how we act. So I think in empathy, it's very similar, right? People who feel like you do need to have a presence and be assertive. But authoritarian means I am the one who is always in control. And that's usually driven by fear. So what are you afraid of? I know when I get afraid, I tend to go into micromanagement mode. And so I look at like, what am I afraid of losing? What am I afraid? If people call me weak, what am I scared of? So my suggestion would be doing some internal reflection. I had to do that a lot with my identity around being an empath and like it can be disorienting, but at the same time, that's exciting because that's where a lot of personal growth comes from.
I think it's hard for the older generations too, who was sold on this idea of climbing the ladder, reaching the top, and then you maintain that top, and you're afraid of losing that control. The newer generation don't care about that, so it's a major shift because now you have to realize, actually, being a leader means enabling other leaders, not controlling people. So it's a conscious shift, but it's also generational. Some of it because we were sold this idea that you thrive at the top. You're sold on this idea of power and prestige and control. Yep. And then you get there and you're like, this is not freedom over here. This sucks.
Yeah.
There's a better way.
Yeah. The State of Workplace Empathy report has some good data on generational divides too. Yeah. And Generation Z, Generation Alpha, they won't tolerate non-empathetic workplaces. So it's now it's something that if you want to attract and retain high quality employees, this is just something that you're going to have to do. Yeah.
And I was just going to make a comment about the importance of listening as well too, because I sort of feel like where we've come from, maybe the history in this country, or this is the nation that I was raised in, and so as a culture, it just is sort of felt very much like you got to be the leader, right? But
yeah,
we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I guess maybe can you talk a little bit, Andrea? Maybe you got a perspective on what's the importance of listening, or how can someone develop better listening skills?
Yeah, I think I am somebody who naturally has a voice in my head, and I want to chime in quickly. So it's definitely a mindfulness practice. it's learning to become comfortable with silence. That's been the hardest thing for me, is especially when I'm in meetings, as I often am, where I'm the one extrovert in a whole room of introverts. Like, I consciously count to 15 in my head to give people enough space to chime in, and recognizing that for me, if it's half a millisecond, it probably feels like too long for me, but just learning to create that space. And then, at Corgi Bites, I ended up marrying my business partner. So we also went to couples therapy together. And one of the best practices that we learned was putting your own stories on the shelf. So when you are listening, like, yeah, you have your perspective, but just consciously saying, I'm going to set my perspective aside for just a moment. I'm going to still recognize I have a perspective. I'm not going to enmesh myself or, go into this merging, but I am going to just consciously quiet the voice in my head, or I'm going to consciously try to not solve problems. And so I think those two practices for me have been really helpful. I think a lot of it also comes down to capacity building, because if we don't functionally have the time, if we're in a system where we feel like everything is urgent and everything is, the sky is falling, we're running on fear, and we can't, the motivation to take the time to listen, it's really hard to see the benefit of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I love the point too. Like, I'm not the smartest person in the room, right? Which is sometimes the hardest thing to put aside, right? Because then it just makes you jump into solving problems. But those are really, really good practical suggestions, I think, that we'll be able to benefit from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think multiple times throughout this conversation, you've kind of hit on some things about, just generally, and I just say this all the time, is be humble.
Yes.
And that's because if you're so caught up in yourself, you aren't going to listen to what other people are saying. It's going to be more painful for you to grow.
Yeah.
Especially as a leader. And then, I think as far as solving conflict, it's just such a big thing, as if you can kind of instill a little bit of that into culture. But are there sort of empathy-based techniques that can kind of help transform those challenging moments we have, when, the opportunities for growth we have in those difficult times? What would you say?
I think the biggest one is experimentation. So going into an experimental mindset. And that requires humility, where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen, but let's try this small change and see if it helps. Mm-hmm. And so, an example there was, my business partner, he, headphones on, he had it on for days. I was in charge of sales and marketing, and a client had called with an answer that I couldn't give. It was too domain specific for software development, and I felt like it was the last responsible moment. So I snuck up on him and I was like, hi. Yeah, I was trying really hard to be empathetic. When he finally saw my attention, it was like, flip the table. He was so frustrated. At that point, I had a chance to either rage quit, which I was tempted to do, or pause. And this is really important, is pause and then go, what just happened? And then in that pause, try to come up with some kind of hypothesis for what you can do next to make it better. So for me in that moment, it was, I don't know what just happened. I have never seen that happen in my professional life, but we've got to figure this out. That's that pebble in the shoe problem. Because if we can't elegantly interrupt each other, we won't be able to run a business together. So, then we hashed it out. And what I learned, he said, well, I was 9 inception layers down. That movie from Christopher Nolan, where it's a dream within a dream within a dream. He's like, and like that scene, I just saw all of my mental models, which I had spent 3 days constructing, collapse. And what you saw was my exasperation and my grief and my fear that I'm not going to now meet my deliverable on time. Well, that changed everything for me, right? And so then I was like, well, okay, we went back and forth. Well, what if I did this? What if I did this? And what we ended up settling on was, well, what if I just asked you the question inception with a question mark and you just replied with a number? He's like, yeah, I could do that. Changed our business. It changed everything. And now it's like, it's really cool because I know the like computational reasons that like that works. But there are very specific things that we can do, but we've got to co-create these experiments together and then try them. And so for us, it's like, great, this worked. Let's keep doing it. There were other ones where it's like, let's try this. And it's like, whoa, that was a dud. But that's how you move through some of these things, because when you get a win, it builds momentum. And then you're more motivated to do it again in the future rather than just move into these siloed groups where there's no interaction, there's no innovation, there's no problem solving. And that to me feels like where we need to move away from.
Oh, Tula, you're muted there.
How fun. Before we wrap up, just staying in this thought process, it's hard for some people to practice empathy, especially if some leaders are not inclined toward it. What's some basic actionable ways that someone can incorporate empathy, even in a small way?
Yeah.
And any thoughts on how to make it more accessible for everyone, especially those who are inclined to be afraid of it?
Yeah. So I think the best phrase that I've seen, especially in software, there's a lot of software developers who have adopted this. So not my quote, it's kind of the shared ethos, is be kind to your future self. So it can be hard to imagine somebody else's because it's an observability problem, especially if you've just met them. You don't have the data. And then we can have conversations about the ethics of privacy concerns and whether or not you should have that data, right? But you have access to your own inner thinking, your own beliefs. You can project a little bit into the future and say, how can I be kind to myself in this work, right? If I take a shortcut or something like that, right? And by getting into that practice of moving yourself into a future state and imagining that perspective, it activates the exact same regions of the brain that you have to use in order to identify with somebody else's perspective. So start with yourself and start just either, reflecting on the past and then also thinking about the future and doing so with a lot of kindness and compassion for yourself. And the best thing about that is you don't have to ask for anybody's permission, no matter how much of a cog you feel like in a wheel, right? Read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. There's a lot of great stuff in there specifically around this. But you do have agency about how you believe about yourself and what you want to think and how you want to imagine the future. So that's my suggestion.
I love that so much. As kind of a final question here, what do you say to those who say that love does not belong in business?
What would I say to that? I can see where it comes from. Like, I think I would start with like some shared understanding. Like, if I think about it, love is very powerful and very intimate. And I don't necessarily want to be intimate with my employees, right? Right? We do want to have some boundaries. So what are we talking about there when we're talking about love? Are we talking about a shared compassion and a shared sense of stewardship and mutual respect and pro-social behavior? Yeah. Are we talking about intimacy? Are we talking about sharing private information? Are we talking about like physical contact? Like, I think love is a very general word. It's powerful for sure. But if we become more specific, this is the concept of emotional granularity that Lisa Feldman Barrett has pioneered. The more specific we can be in about how we feel, then we can move into action. So if it's like, okay, well, what part of love doesn't belong there? And I think having that kind of mindful inquiry where it's not a like, well, you're wrong, right? but really trying to figure out and tease it apart. I think that's something to me. But yeah, immediately, like if somebody was skeptical, and I deal with a lot of skeptics in my line of work, I can see how that sentiment might come about. But I doubt that people think that we shouldn't respect each other. I doubt that people think that we shouldn't care about each other. I think that maybe just the word itself feels a little too vulnerable. So maybe there's a better word that fits.
Do you think the word empathy had the same connotation in business like 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, I think it still has the same connotation in business. Yeah, I do. Yeah. And, some of that is it's the colloquial understanding versus the technical understanding of it. And we have to respect both. Like, not everybody is going to be like me and nerd out for a decade and like get really excited when academic articles come out about this stuff, right? Most people are going to be like, okay, it's the dictionary definition. So we have to respect that in a lot of terms, there's kind of this dual understanding.
I think there's a lot of education to be done about love too. The 3 different types of love, philia, agape, eros, and which one is appropriate in the workplace, which is more like philia, which is the love amongst friends. So just like empathy, we're still needing to educate a lot. I think there's a next level of educating, the next level of empathy, which is really applying love, but the appropriate love for the circumstances.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think when you can learn to not just write off somebody's opinion or beliefs, because everybody's beliefs and everybody's behavior makes sense to them. Right? Your behavior makes sense to you. Right? And the thing is like, how can I get your behavior to make sense to me? And sometimes I don't want to do that work. Sometimes it's like, nope, I do not have the energy or the capacity to put in the work to try to understand how you're acting. And that's a boundary that I have to set for myself. Other times, especially like with these pebble problems, right? We're interacting with people frequently and it's like slightly frustrating and like there's friction. We knew that if we solve this problem, then it makes sense, right? To really dig in and get this shared understanding. A lot of times just doing this with the people around you. Like I know there are people in my sphere that don't vote like me, right? And it's been really hard to like listen and understand. And when we do that, we realize, oh, we actually share a lot of the same values. We just differ in how we think we want to get there. And then it's like, okay, let's eat Thanksgiving together, right? Like, and to me, I think that's really important now more than ever, is to take a big collective deep breath and recognize that, we don't have to accept everybody's behavior. We can hold people accountable. We absolutely need to set personal boundaries, but we can't run away from the system that we're in. We're in it. And we either all find ways to interact effectively with the people around us so that we can solve problems, or we silo ourselves and we start to make them worse. So.
Well said. I know our listeners are going to take a lot away from this conversation. Where should they go to get more information about you and what we're talking about today? Maybe especially those in software development.
Yeah. So you can go to andreagoulet.com. Right now, it's a lot about my keynote speaking and things like that. Empathyintech.com is a community. I host a podcast with Ray Myers. So we have conversations like this all the time, which is so much fun. The other, I think for software developers specifically, there's another community we founded, Legacy Code Rocks. And this is one of the things that I love, is that people who love working on existing software systems and making them better are some of the kindest and most compassionate and most caring people I have ever met. And and one of the reasons I started doing this work is because I wanted them to see how good with people they are, the way I saw them, even though they weren't identifying with that themselves. So Legacy Code Rocks, legacycode.rocks. And then LinkedIn is where I'm probably the most active. And I have a newsletter called Empathy in Tech. I post typically long form things with lots of references in them. So those are probably the best places to follow my work at the moment.
All right, excellent. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for everyone who's tuned in. We will be back on air Tuesday, Wednesday, and live on Thursdays. And we will see you on the next Bliss Business Podcast.
Thanks.